Hi, this is Adam Carroll, and that was our guest, Marlene is Spoerri, who we will be speaking with very shortly. I am the UN Program Director for Justice for All, and one of our program's longest running program is Burma Task Force. And today we'll be speaking about Burma and the elections. We'll be speaking about Burma's unfair elections this week, in fact, this past Sunday, and perhaps comparing them to our rather strange election season. It's a little awkward for us as Americans to point fingers at election irregularities overseas, given all the antics of the current administration. But we will do so because it's very important to keep basic standards of democracy and democratic transition. So, as you all know, the Rohingya minority has been suffering from genocide and various forms of oppression, very extreme. And the UN agencies have famously called the Rohingya minority the world's most persecuted. So today we have as our guest Marlene Spoerri, Director of Inclusive Democracy and Systems Change at Independent Diplomat, a nonprofit diplomatic advisory group striving to create more inclusive and just diplomatic processes. And Marlene also is the author of Engineering Revolution, The Paradox of Democracy Promotion in Serbia, published by University of Pennsylvania Press, which sounds really interesting. That could be a whole nother show. I just got into an argument on Facebook about Serbia, and I'm still feeling the bruises. But Marlene, maybe if you could say a few more things about Independent Diplomat.
Sure, thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me to the show, and I look forward to our discussion. Independent Diplomat is a diplomatic advisory group. Our mission is really to support more inclusive diplomatic processes, ensuring that all those with a stake in conflict resolution and addressing the conflicts that affect them are included in the decision making about their future. So we believe that more inclusive diplomatic processes will result in more sustainable peace. And we work with a variety of partners that are committed to human rights and justice and international law across conflicts in the Middle East, Asia, Latin America, and help essentially give them the tools and resources so they can be more effective advocates on their own behalf within UN-led diplomatic processes.
There's often a great gap. I was just speaking with some allies at the UN, other NGOs that are quite well known, about how sometimes only a few representatives from an impacted community has access to UN or diplomatic people. And so sometimes that means that they don't share that access, and people end up thinking nothing is happening. And it's very hard to manage this kind of relationship building. I was very impressed, though, that this new report of yours really puts Rohingya front and center. In fact, they are co-authors. We see that I know Tun Kin and Razia Sultana, and also Yasmin Ola. I know them well. I don't know your other writer, but it's really impressive that they are co-authors of this report. I see that the title is Unfree, Unfair, and Anti-Democratic, and that says quite a lot regarding a so-called democratic election. So as we jump into this, I was wondering, would you like to summarize this this report for the viewers?
Sure. And yes, I mean, I think one of the, the key value added of this report is that it's written by Rohingya representatives themselves, where they are, really in the driver's seat in terms of shaping policy recommendations regarding the elections, and they're looking to put forward constructive recommendations to the international community as it looks to respond not only to the elections, but to the aftermath of the elections and their dealings with the next government, because of course we don't want to see a situation in which these last elections create a precedent for further disenfranchisement. In terms of the substance of this report, it really looks at the exclusion of the Rohingya community, which dates back to the previous elections of 2015. And it discusses not only the current state of disenfranchisement, but really the abrupt departure of exclusion, which, while the Rohingya have been denied citizenship for quite some time in Myanmar, there was a history of participation which predated the 2015 elections. And there was a history of Rohingya involvement as politicians, and they were able to represent their constituents in parliament. And that history was abruptly overturned in 2015. And I think very sadly, despite, the international community's emphasis on Myanmar's democratic transition, what we've seen is that the Rohingya continue to be excluded from that democratic transition, and are not able to have their voices heard and represented within Burmese society as a result.
I wanted to ask, first of all, I don't know if all viewers can hear it, but there is a bit of chirping sound. It's not birds and it's not crickets. So I don't know if it's something you could adjust your sound in any way. Otherwise, we'll just go forward. It's not awful. It's just a little bit noticeable. Anyway, the disenfranchisement of the Rohingya, while in some ways, as you were suggesting, incremental, was very abrupt in 2015, which is when Aung San Suu Kyi came to power, basically as state councilor, and her party came into a power-sharing relationship with the military. One wonders about possible deals regarding Rohingya rights to vote and run in office. I believe that it's true that in 2015, her party refused to have any Muslim candidates. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And in this election, there was a slight change in that, and there were a few Muslim candidates, but no Rohingya candidates. And Rohingya politicians were quite deliberately barred from competing within these elections, despite the efforts of many established Rohingya politicians to represent their constituents within Rohingya representative parties. They were, barred across the board.
So this lack of real democracy, well, it's got a lot of social support apparently. But it's also alienated other ethnic groups as well. On top of that, I understand the pandemic has become a pretext to exclude yet others from voting. If you could say a little bit about that.
Yes, the pandemic, of course, has affected all countries, and I think Myanmar hasn't been an exception to that. There was in September an outbreak in Rakhine State, which then has spread to Yangon. Now, of course, Myanmar blocks access to information in Rakhine State and in many of the conflict-affected areas in Rakhine State. So I think, in terms of the numbers and the precise toll of the pandemic within Rakhine State, I think many of us are quite unsighted. But yes, Myanmar, much as they did in 2015, opted not to include the many conflict-affected areas within Rakhine State. And, just weeks before the elections, announced that, more than half of the affected communities in Rakhine State would actually not be able to participate in these elections. And they have claimed that this is merely a postponement for a time when conflict is at a rate where elections can be held. But of course, what we saw in 2015 was that postponement ultimately meant disenfranchisement, and there was not an electoral process that was held in these areas. And I think there's a very clear concern that in fact these elections will not take place, and that disenfranchisement itself affected more than a million people inside conflict-affected areas.
So I guess in the U.S. we see all kinds of ways that the powers that be undermine democracy through gerrymandering, through packing the courts, then having court cases about vote counting or how many boxes will be available to put absentee ballots in, all kinds of noise and all kinds of controversy. I guess absentee ballots were not being offered to these ethnic minorities in Burma. Were there any discussions or controversies about the election in Burma itself?
Indeed. I mean, there has been an active discussion amongst the Rohingya candidates and others in the electorate, about the need for a more inclusive electoral process. And there has been, there was an effort early on to potentially ban certain election monitors, domestic election monitors, from even monitoring the elections. And so it's been a long and contentious process, and I think it has involved many segments of the community, and that includes the Rohingya as well, who have sought, both inside Myanmar and outside of Myanmar, to advance their rights to vote and to be included within this electoral process.
I was on a call with some Rohingya and also other Burmese ethnic leaders over the weekend, and the Rohingya were very depressed because here they were. These are members of the Rohingya diaspora, very lucky in a way to be here in the U.S., but very depressed because they're in the midst of this highly publicized election, the U.S. election, and then they're hearing how back home their whole community is left out and excluded, and they can't be part of it, and they're no longer. I mean, they're not able to be part of the U.S. election yet. Their status doesn't quite allow it. So they were really depressed. It was sad, and but as far as getting to what the international community should be doing, but I wanted to start with what unfortunately it seems to have been doing, namely complicity. I remember in 2015, we noticed that the UK government and a few other governments were funding census activities that excluded the Rohingya that was leading up to the election. So wondering about international complicity here, are UN and other agencies basically turning a blind eye to the irregularities, or what are they doing?
Well, I think the fact is that, you know, in the run up to the 2015 elections, there was a great deal of international investment in this, the notion of Myanmar making embarking on a democratic transition. And the 2020 elections were meant to seem as a kind of seminal moment of a step toward democratic consolidation. And there was a great deal of investment within the electoral machinery, the Union Election Commission, and other facets of the electoral process to ensure that the process would be one that was, democratic, free, fair. And I think, the challenge is that's confronted for the international community is that investment has continued even as they have seen, that the UAC and the government have not really been committed to an inclusive process, and the architecture of the electoral apparatus and the electoral process is so exclusionary, and ultimately racist that it is really hard to justify the notion that this is in fact a democratic process, and that Myanmar is inching closer towards a democratic transition, when in fact one could argue that along several fronts the electoral process has become less democratic than it was perhaps in 2015, particularly when we're talking about conflict-affected areas in Rakhine State.
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a fake election in many respects, at least hollow in some ways. Well, I guess the report itself is asking for the right to vote, the right to compete, the right to a fair process, the right to full citizenship for Rohingya, and these rights don't seem to be available right now. They seem to be taken away. I know that Shui Mong, who's an MP who now lives in the U.S., was a Rohingya who was in the parliament, not before 2015. He and others like him would like to see Rohingya allowed back in a real pluralistic system. Do you see support for such a system among Burmese civil society groups?
Yeah, I mean, on that point, I would just emphasize, I think one of the great tragedies of this crisis really is the degree to which, the Rohingya see themselves as segments of the Burmese society. They want to go home. They see themselves as Burmese, and so this, stripping them of their right to citizenship, stripping them of their dignity and their claims to their identity, I think is one of the great tragedies of this conflict. And their exclusion from the electoral process is only further exacerbates that exclusion and that denial. I think I think there has been a great deal of outreach between other minority groups that have been similarly excluded and oppressed by the government, and so I think there's growing solidarity, there's growing efforts, particularly within groups within Rakhine State and outside in other conflict-affected areas. But unfortunately, I think the NLD and others have really kind of sought to capitalize on the worst instincts of some when it comes to the Rohingya and spreading misinformation and hostility.
There was a lot of concern a few months ago that there would really be an increase in hate speech online leading up to the election. Did you find that, or perhaps not as much as expected?
I think there was a great deal of hate speech, and that did ramp up over the last few weeks. But I think perhaps what we saw in 2015 and during the genocide, with respect to the mobilization of Facebook and other social media tools as a platform to disseminate hate speech, I don't think that went quite to the same level that we saw previously.
It seems that Facebook has actually finally taken some action regarding the U.S. elections. Perhaps it's done the same in Burma. I don't know if we have any information about that, but to really slow down the process of spreading false information and to have some fact checks built in, it's certainly better than nothing. And Facebook has really been a vehicle for hate for so long in Burma. It's good. It's a hopeful sign. Wondering, well, on the other hand, at a UN affiliated agency called International IDEA created an election app that I understand was used to exclude Rohingya candidates in some way. And I don't know if despite being criticized by a lot of groups, human rights groups like ours, if they ever responded or gave a good reason for that kind of role of serving a fundamentally unfair election.
I think they're probably not alone in this. I can't comment specifically on that point, but I think everyone has struggled to really be able to justify, support for a process that is so exclusionary and so blatantly at odds with a genuine democratic process.
I noticed in the Irrawaddy newspaper that the U.S. has congratulated Myanmar on a free and fair election or something like that. I mean, there wasn't much in the way of criticism. And it was an embarrassment, frankly. I see that there's actually a statement from Mitch McConnell in the Senate that just was issued. Perhaps we'll put that on the comments. It's actually a little better, but really, it's kind of, well, I would put it as diplomatic. And I know you're an independent diplomat, and you're working with people who haven't the need to be sometimes vague, purposefully vague, and polite and indirect. All of those can be tools for coming to some common ground. But for others, especially human rights advocates, it can be extremely frustrating to deal with diplomatic speech. So in short, we're glad that there's a bridge like your group that can somehow play the role of translator when real issues need to be clearly discussed, and yet one doesn't want to alienate or break down the discussion entirely. So do you find any particular challenges in your role, including on Burma, in terms of trying to get member nations to maybe strengthen their policies on this?
Well, having worked for a while on this issue, I think in 2017, after the genocide, there was, an enormous outrage at the genocide and a sentiment that the international community couldn't let this go without a, credible, serious response, and that there would be accountability for the atrocities. And I've seen over the past 3 years that, that belief in the international community to actually, protect civilians and create accountability mechanisms has dwindled over the past 3 years. And today, I think the reality is that there has not been a great deal of faith in the multilateral institutions that we have to deliver the steps and the policies that are needed to hold perpetrators of these kind of atrocities to account. And there has been, I think an absence of leadership on the world stage that has created a certain, a disbelief on the part of many in the international community that they can actually affect these issues for the better. And so in terms of the response to the elections, I think I was happy to see that the UK and the State Department as well, and the EU to a degree, did reference the lack of inclusion of the Rohingya in the process, and were clear that was a stain on the credibility of the process. But I think what we need to see now is a deliberate strategy to ensure that what we saw in 2020 does not go repeated in the next elections. And I thought it was hopeful that the UK in particular emphasized the 1982 citizenship law and really called that out and said that needs to be seriously reformed. I hope that as governments look to readjust their policy after these elections, they're going to look very seriously at that law and see what can be done to ensure that there's actual reform of that law. Because Myanmar itself committed to tackling that law in the Annan Advisory Commission recommendations, and in signing on to those, they agreed that they would also tackle that law.
Yeah, I realize the whole system of ID cards and all of that needs to be reformed. It seems to be a system of hierarchy and exclusion rather than simply identity. Linking citizenship to ethnic identity seems to be inherently problematic. With your recommendations at the end of the report, there are kind of 3 sets of recommendations, and maybe just starting with some of the recommendations for the international community, both now and looking beyond. Are there any others that you'd like to underscore?
Well, I think it's really, time to ensure that when we're discussing Myanmar and policy towards Myanmar, that we're looking at concrete benchmarks that need to be set, and having a clear timeline along which we expect reforms to be made. I think it's been quite some time now since the advisory commission released its recommendations. We've really seen no implementation since then. I think, unfortunately, kind of the time for just issuing advice and hoping that Myanmar is going to make the reforms that have been asked of it is really over. And we need to be very clear about what expectations there are of Myanmar over the months. The EU, for example, has a trade deal with Myanmar, the Everything But Arms deal, which is really a privilege that countries get in exchange for making human rights reforms. And I think the fact is Myanmar is not kind of meeting the bar for that privilege, and that should be on the table as the EU and others consider next steps and how to work with this next government to ensure that adequate reforms are taken.
Yeah, that's a big one. I noticed you also request the international community end its involvement in international electoral observation missions, given that the minimal requirements of an inclusive, free, and fair electoral process have not been met. So I don't know if some would argue against that as more dangerous to let it go on without observation, but it's certainly clear, and it addresses the concern about complicity. Were there international observers during this election?
There were observers. They due to COVID, there was a much kind of reduced and scaled back presence. But there were observers. But you know, there is also a precedent for not sending observers where an election is not deemed as meeting the threshold of a genuine democratic process. I mean, you know, you look at Venezuela and the upcoming elections there, the EU has said clearly that it will not send an electoral observation mission for precisely this reason, because the elections are not deemed to meet that threshold. And so, you know, I think, you know, if those standards are applied, then they should also be applied, you know, in cases like this where there's such obvious discrimination and exclusion.
Well, that's interesting. Right after the break, I'm going to ask if perhaps this moment, now that it's been made very clear that Aung San Suu Kyi is politically very strong, is this the time to ask her for reforms? So stay tuned and we'll be back in just a moment. This is UN This Week.
Assalamu alaikum everyone, it's your brother Zain Bika from South Africa. One of the first educational programs ever produced for Muslim children was the ever popular Adam's World series. The colorful and comical Muslim puppets stole the heart of a generation. Sound Vision will be releasing brand new episodes of Adam's World with the launch of a Adam's World app. Subscribers will enjoy new Adam's World episodes as they are released, as well as all the classic episodes of Adam's World. So visit adamsworldapp.com now to learn more, subscribe and enjoy new adventures of Adam and his friends. And let's keep helping tomorrow's Muslims today. Assalamu alaikum.
It's Adam's World. Believe me, there's a lot to see. Bismillah, let's explore.
And this is Adam Carroll back with UN This Week with guest Marlene Spoerri and with independent diplomat. I keep almost saying independent Democrat because it's a political club where I grew up and I worked for them briefly. So what do you think? Is this the moment to ask Aung San Suu Kyi to really implement some constitutional reforms with her, I guess, more or less landslide victory, despite the power sharing with the military? Is this the moment where she can take action?
I think there is no moment like the present, and particularly after these elections, I think, you know, I think the international community was quite tempered in its approach in the run up to the elections, and I think now that we have this process more or less completed, now is quite evidently the time to be clear about what the expectations should be of the new government, and to really assess whether, you know, the investment in this elections resulted in you know what it was intended to do, and if not, to really rethink policy towards Myanmar, and what can be done to ensure that over the next few years real progress is made with respect to the rights of the Rohingya and other ethnic and religious minorities. I mean, let us not forget that, you know, more than 700,000 people were forced out of the country in 2017. And, you know, over the past 3 years, we really haven't had a serious discussion about how how to bring those people back home in a way that is safe and voluntary and dignified. And, the government has taken no steps really to advance that in a credible way. And conditions in the camps in Cox's Bazar are becoming increasingly untenable. Violence is increasing. I think we need to start really looking at the situation and not simply accepting the status quo, but actually looking at what can be done to bring these people back home in a way that is safe.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to throw a sort of curveball at you then and ask you, since you worked on Serbia, you wrote a book, what do you see any kind of similarities with the sort of journey of democracy in Serbia with the current situation in Burma?
That's a tough one. I think they're two quite different cases. I think that democratic transitions can, don't always go in a straight line. But I think the issue of the disenfranchisement of the Rohingya is something different than what Serbia was confronting with, which was an authoritarian, really quasi dictatorship, which made it impossible for opposition groups to compete on a level playing field. The disenfranchisement of ethnic and religious communities in the conflict affected areas is a little bit of a different dynamic. But I would say, I think, where I do see a similarity is that the international community was pretty clear with Serbia that its atrocities would not go unpunished. There was a criminal international justice mechanism in place. We had the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. In response to the ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, there was an intervention. I think you have seen kind of none of that to that degree in Burma. And I think, to some extent you can see what the consequences are of total impunity. And that is that, violence is rising across Rakhine State, and we are no closer to a genuine democratic process with respect to the inclusion of the Rohingya.
It would be very sad to think that it was the NATO bombs that made the difference in the case of Serbia and its neighbors, but that may be. But what force is behind the UN efforts? We have the criminal court processes, which is something. Maybe with the new administration coming in Washington, we'll have a bit stronger support for these mechanisms instead of harassment of criminal court staff and prosecutor. So moving forward then, what would you personally like to see the US government or the UN, for that matter, prioritize for the Rohingya people?
Well, I think there needs to be a real kind of looking at the 1982 citizenship law, and how that can be, if not completely overturned, then what can be done to reform that law, because that really kind of sowed the seeds for a lot of the disenfranchisement that we're seeing today, and the persecution and the oppression of the community. In terms of the United States, I'm hopeful that we will see a return to a belief in the multilateral system to protect the most vulnerable communities, and to ensure that international law is upheld. Certainly we've seen the retreat, with respect to support for the ICC. We might see a change in that, and that could have consequences. I think there's no question that the divisions within the Security Council will remain, irrespective of, who is at the helm of the U.S. administration. But I think, you might see an effort to put forward, more of an emphasis on accountability, potentially, try for Security Council resolutions, because we have seen that, the Burmese military does respond when there's pressure put on the accountability front, and when it believes that there's a possibility that there might be an ICC referral or movement on that track. And so I think continuing to emphasize those issues is important, and to draw attention to the plight of the Rohingya, and not to simply accept the situation that we're currently in, and continue to push for change is important. And that includes prioritizing these issues within bilateral relationships and economic relationships and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Well, kind of ending on one note of one aspect of democracy, which is inclusion. Again, as I started by saying, it's quite impressive that you put Rohingya co-authors front and center, had their voices as part of this report. And what would you like to see along these lines going forward with this and other conflict and crisis situations? How can we better put the impacted community in the forefront of dialogue and problem solving?
Well, I think we continue to need to ensure that affected communities are doing advocacy on their own behalf, and we need to be creating platforms for affected communities to discuss the full nuances of their positions, and to put them in a position where they're driving policy, and not only kind of showcasing individuals as victims, but really putting them in the driver's seat on identifying solutions. And I think that is key, in many issues, because certainly the Rohingya partners that we've worked with are all very knowledgeable, have great ideas. They simply have been denied opportunities time and again to speak to the Security Councils, to speak to key decision makers, and I think that's one of the key problems in the international system, including in the multilateral system, that non-state actors continue to be deprived a role in these discussions that affect them.
Well, another reminder that democracy matters, and part of that is listening and talking. And I really appreciate you joining our show, Marlene. This is an ongoing issue, and as the viewers know, we will revisit the case of the Rohingya and also other ethnic minorities of Burma. Hopefully this will help, and hopefully all these efforts will help build a real pathway to hope and inclusion for persecuted people. So thank you, everybody. Thanks, Marlene. This is all for today, and we will see you next time. Thank you.